My name is Myrtille Lacoste, and I am French, but I spent most of the last, the entirety of the last 15 years in the other hemisphere. And so that you understand where I come from and from what background what I'm going to describe comes from. My interest is in the diversity, explaining and understanding the diversity of agricultural systems. And I have looked at very contrasted environment, ranging from the very broadacre environment to subsistence farming. And looking into the diversity of agriculture means you have to look into the diversity of farmers' practices. And I am part of that school of thought who looks at what farmers do rather than what they may think. And that has led others to be interested in asking me, how do we engage farmers, generally speaking, in research and other activities, and more specifically, in digital technologies. This is a reason why I am in France, thanks to the vast and already complex French ecosystem. I have many organizations to thank, and first of whom make it, the Montpellier Advanced Knowledge Institute on Transition. So I will respond to Julia by making the linkage between innovation ecosystem platforms and on-farm experimentation. And if there is one thing to remember from what I will describe, is that to foster innovation that is data-driven, OFE and IEPs need space. So I will say in a bit of a different way, yet similar things to Julia to start with. When I think about innovation ecosystem, I think of people, relationships, and activities, as well as overlapping business models. And all of that is sometimes, not always, but sometimes facilitated by digital technologies. Another way to call this is essentially a pattern chaos, and I use words with intention. It's important to describe this constellation, this complex entity, because then we can start to characterize the function of that entity that we're interested in, which is how to foster emerging innovation, the emergence of innovation. Now, in this context, an innovation ecosystem platform, or IEP, has been described by the World Bank as a network of people from different backgrounds who can make sense out of new information and create an enabling environment for people to learn, organize, and make better decisions together. A more digestible definition, I find, is defining IEPs as a space for people, organizations, and society to orchestrate innovation. Essentially, it's about people coming from different horizons and trying to find alignment. And we heard about that process just before, how it does take steps, it takes time, and it's not always a very obvious thing to do. Finding alignment is a process. And that's by trying to align value propositions, and those are plural, that's very important. We all have different private interests, it needs to be recognized if we want to move forward. In order to prototype, design, and test business models, things which are going to work out in real life. So the role of digital technologies in this, I see three main categories. First, it's about helping with making linkages. So Zoom, WhatsApp, I mean, we all understood during the pandemic the role those things can have. They are important. And then on the startup side, we have everything that has to do with communications in agriculture, and we had an example with Seedling, for instance. Then another role is creation, is assisting with the creation process within the IEP, helping people to create. And hopefully we will have an example in this very conference through Clack soon, which is an online platform so that people can create better together, or at least enable that process. I think OFE is also a tool to help creation, and I will detail that. And then it's anything that typically is talked about in terms of being a developer tool or any new technologies that may focus dialogue. And finally, a third role is what I'd call an ecosystem booster. So the World Bank has one on policies. We heard about, I think it was Apple just earlier, an easy app store, and of course there is Google. And so essentially that's when digital technologies have so many functions that they start to create and expand the innovation ecosystem by even creating new communities of users and developers. So the first thing to bounce back on Julia's presentation is that what's important is that, yes, it's complex, it's messy, it often has to be, but there's a lot of knowledge about how things work now in an innovation ecosystem. We have that knowledge from the corporate world, from the management and business literature, and more, even in agricultural academia. And the first implication is that almost all, because there's always the agricultural specificity, almost all that has been learned applies in agriculture. We already have best practices to develop agricultural AIPs. Strategic development, joint exploration, typologies of project to put intelligence on what we're doing, or at least be more conscious in what we try to foster. So second implication, and here we can look at, if you need to think about at least one group, it would be Google. Google has space for innovation. They create the condition and the environment to foster that system. And we heard that from Julia as well. So our policies need to make space within the many priorities they have for IEPs. Now you may think that actually we already have IEPs, and frankly they do exist, in the form of incubators and startups, or of grower groups or other agricultural associations. But really in the first case, it's about nurturing external innovation, and it's always commercially driven, while there is a space in IEPs for the public sector as well. And in grower group, it's more about the informal sharing of information between peers, so between farmers typically, and perhaps machinery dealer or an advisor. But we all know that, by large, it's still a linear transfer model by which innovation comes from elsewhere, and then the farmer has to deal and do something with it. So you still may ask, why bother? There's a lot of risk in terms of wastage of our precious time and resources. Yet another workshop, do we really need to have that? Well, first of all, it's not just a workshop. It's about co-creation aimed toward practical action, which is prototyping. It means that the interest and investments of our time and resources must be sustained by the potential value creation of all participants and therefore gain. Then, for researchers and others, it's about gaining a broader insight into the ecosystem. That's strategic knowledge, which is a practical mechanism to move away from transfer to exchange of knowledge in a more open innovation fashion. What are other people doing in the ecosystem, and what are their perspectives? And that's the fundamental of finding mutual interest so that we can develop shared or at least overlapping value propositions. In research, where efforts are very often very focused, that's the nature of what we do, how those efforts might be relevant in a different way. It's often unexpected. It's not always obvious because people think differently. So putting several brains together with a little serendipity does help find solutions we may not have anticipated before. And finally, it's about impacting the ecosystem, having a chance to shape the demand rather than receiving it or trying to interpret it and then applying for projects. Especially so if we can try to involve policymakers early. And there are examples in the literature where this has happened, and it works well if the intention is there. And finally, if you need one more reason why we need IEPs, is because we are missing out, by large, in the formal research sector, on farmers' own research and innovation. So this is a way to capture it. In the same way that the automotive industry is capturing the UX experience of the people who are eventually going to purchase cars. So as a summary, IEPs are a way to elicit insight into the ecosystem, so what people do and why, to identify value propositions, their interests, so that we may align business models, so essentially assessing the feasibility of what we're proposing. The issue with agriculture is that people, and first of most farmers, are a lot less transparent than the user of a car or of an Apple phone. There's usually a socio-economic organization that is anchored in history, in local specificities. There's a good reason why there's so many social scientists among us who spend lifetime trying to understand what's happening in agriculture. And also, we will always still need to dig holes to look at soil profiles. Even with the best digital tools, we will never fully replace a shovel. So how may OFE help in this context? Well, on-farm experimentation is about going from farm-level, observable innovation to data-driven, evidence-based ideas and prototypes that may be explored in the IEP and that could be of interest to other members of the ecosystem, of the broader industry. And what is really key is that the OFE allows to check right away what is the local relevance, including identifying the socio-technical gaps, so all the complexity I mentioned before, as well as managing, as we heard it prior, what could be called the combinatory explosion, which is we have agroecology, we've got the specificity of context, we can't test 1,000 treatments, we need to make choices, and those choices need to be intelligent, and we can't lose time just testing, and sometimes it's just not practical. So how do we manage that? And OFE is a way. So we heard about ecosystem niches before. IEPs don't need to be a single thing. They can exist in different ways. They can exist. They can coexist, and I'll explain more about that. One role of the IEP, based on an OFE, is to test technologies, ideas. But so prototype validation, an IEP may come up with prototypes, so then we need to go back to the OFE and test it. Just we have to be, and I would say that this is actually the dominant model in what we're doing as scientists collaborating with farmers and industry. But we have to be careful to maintain co-creation and not go into the good old farmer will test what we think is adequate. That's the main danger. Then IEPs and OFE-based IEP can be understood as for gathering information. We have several IEPs, OFEs that exist in different environments. It's a way to find out how a policy might be relevant and helping things move beyond the one-size-fits-all. It's also a way, of course, to collect information so that we may perform meta-analysis. And finally, and that's where this is actually one of the greatest potential of IEPs, it's in creation, and that I think is not done enough. It's about coming together very early on when we have a technology and talk about how it may be useful for different parties, and knowing that once again the interest that will fuel the process will be the management insight for the farmer, the data for the researcher. We need data, we need to write papers, it's a reality, and IP for startups. And as I mentioned, there's no need for a single model to exist. In fact, they may all feed into each other in a cycle of continuous improvement. And for those who have seen the OFE process described in this way, this is actually what we go back to action research and participatory research, is that it's all about a cycle. Nothing is fixed, it has to move forward in an iterative fashion. So let's say that we got platforms, fantastic. The next question is, how do we avoid many of the mistakes of the past? Because IEPs, it's a social process, and wherever there are social processes, there's usually problems, because we're humans. So how do we avoid things like access issues? Because nepotisms develop. It's not always easy for everybody to have access to key players in the ecosystem. How do we deal with power imbalances? We can't ignore them, they exist. How do we manage hierarchies that ensue? And what about the administrative burden and the cost of having yet again another structure? How are you going to cater for the agricultural specificities, the long-term nature of farming, the fact that it has to be context specific? Well, what I'd like to propose and what we could think about is to think about those platforms as a transient, temporary thing. To assemble on a per-need basis, to keep small, agile, and diverse, so that it may be suited to different circumstances, and to discard. Once the prototypes and the partnership has produced something, let's move on, and next we may create another one again, but it will be slightly different, and that means that a need will have been identified and addressed. Or if there are blockages that we can move past. So I know, so in summary, like once it works, put it in the bin, because it's all about learning something. That's what matters. It's about the knowledge increase. Again, the process of continuous improvement, and I go back to the automotive industry with the Taguchi statistical methods and the Kaizen philosophy, which are all about that process of continuous improvement. And I know that among us, some will be horrified because we are an industry where we like to build things, models, structures, and they have to be improved and optimized, and it will never be perfect, and it will be useful, and we need to keep building them. But perhaps in this case, we actually need to go away from that model. And in many respects, that's what startups do at the beginning of the cycle. And that's a way to make the most of innovation ecosystems and our increasing knowledge of them. As we understand more how they function, how they compose, their structure, like Julia mentioned, we may respond to them in an open innovation fashion that is agile, responsive, connected, of course, with digital technologies, and inclusive, which is a key word. So to conclude, ecosystem innovation platforms, transient or not, that's for discussion. Sometimes it will be intuitive, but it will never be simplistic unless we repeat the mistakes. That tends to happen as soon as social processes are involved. So we need a space for people, to act in an IEP. And for that, we need to have OFE-based IEPs to be considered as a full entity that deserves the attention of our policymakers and of the funding, so that we may have the enabling environment. And the second thing is to orchestrate innovation. Once we have the space, well, we need the skills. We need the dedicated innovation brokers, facilitators, intermediaries. There's a demand for those people, and yet it's very often very difficult to find them. Even though they do exist very often, but they are spread in the industry and not easy to recognize. And they have skills such as reflexive monitoring, stakeholder engagement, working at the interface, project planning, negotiation, of course, transdisciplinary expertise that must include agronomy. And finally, of course, we need to upskill ourselves as researchers. How do we manage this environment? And finally, perhaps even more than the digital infrastructure, because personally, I trust that we are moving forward in terms of digital technologies. What we need is a social organization of actions. We need to have effective processes. But really, what else could you expect from the person chairing the people and processes session? So this was also my way to introduce our speakers, who will talk about many of those aspects in more detail. I don't think we've got time for questions. We are going to... before that, sorry. Before I welcome you, Lawrence, I would like to thank the people who were behind many of the discussions that led to this response. Matthew McNee, who is the other half in lots of the concepts I explained. Simon Cook and Véronique Bellon-Morel, who were very supportive and often provided the inspiration in many of what I described. And of course, our speaker, Julia Marcoca, for her keynotes. Thank you.